Hi, my name is Jeff Pulliam, and you are watching Video Blast number 7, where today we're going to be talking about the project charter, and specifically we're going to look at what constraints are. Now, I want to go back a little bit here shortly and talk about assumptions as compared to constraints, but we need to talk about what a constraint is. And you need to look at a constraint as a hard and true fact of the matter. That is, it is an absolute rock solid and immovable part of that project. And so it's firmly planted within that project environment as it's reflected in your project charter. And stakeholders need to know that. And so it is best depicted here in the image of a rock. In this case, it's Devil's Peak in Wyoming, because quite frankly, no one's going to be moving Devil's Peak. And so in your project, immovable objects are constraints that we need to figure out and how to work around. So going back quickly to review assumptions is that we know an assumption is a presumed fact and something that we imagine as true. And so in the depiction here of the project manager thinking of creating that project environment, well, she is here thinking and assuming a number of things in a project here that she's managing, which looks like to be a travel event. So again, know the differences between constraint assumptions, where constraints are facts and assumptions are statements of facts which we believe will be true. So types of constraints. There are a great number of internal and external constraints as I see them. Internal constraints have to do with the performance of the project. So we speak about budget, we speak about the calendar, we think of the schedule for the project, and so we need to discuss those types of constraints because you may have a deadline of a particular date that you need to meet. We have scope of work constraints. So there may be certain ways that work needs to be done, and there's only one way, and because of that, we need to share that constraint. And then of course we speak to resource constraints, because many times you'll find when you manage projects, you're not going to have the resources that you need. So then, because that is a constraint, how are you going to deal with it? How are you going to work around it? So again, quickly reviewing, we've got budget constraints, we've got schedule constraints, we've got scope of work constraints, and of course we have resource constraints. And these are just naming a few. As you go through and look at the PMBOK, you'll see a number of the knowledge areas that will something to be thinking about when you think about constraints. Now of course there are external constraints, which is the law. And the law is something that we need to work our project within. And so if there are laws that are impacting your work, we need to know what those laws are. And of course there's government regulations, and with government regulations they're going to want to know what the work is that you're doing and make sure that you're following regulatory protocol, and this is very important to understand. So when we think about the external constraints, we think about those things that are outside of our project environment but are going to impact it, and that could be the law, and that's going to be government regulation. So an example would be when you build a new house, you need to get the plans reviewed and approved by the government, and the government will send out inspectors to make sure that you are doing the work correctly. So constraints and high-level risks. Constraints have certainty. They are rock solid. They are like Devil's Peak, and that's what we need to consider when we think of something that's immovable and rock solid in our projects. But the question is, since constraints are true and known as fact, how do you think we may impact our high-level risks in project charter? Well, we need to consider constraints because they're going to add an additional pressure and stress to the project charter, and stakeholders need to know about that. So I want you to think about, how do constraints bring pressure and stress, especially if they're absolute and immovable within the project environment. That is Video Blast number 7. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you let me know if you have any questions, and have a great afternoon.